The interesting thing about jewelry for me and why it's kept me on this path is the fact that you adjust your necklaces, you look at your earrings, and the men in our lives might be sort of saying to you, but this is just for girl stuff. But the truth is that jewelry is something which talks about the history and the culture of our entire civilization. And what's important to me is that you think that jewelry is the thing that tells us about society. And in fact, if we really analyze in history, everything we can find out about jewelry, that tells us who we were as a species, what we did, what was our trends, what were our rituals, what was our way of living. So historians have actually taken jewelry and turned it into something that is incredibly important for study of civilization. This is how it all began with me. I was raised in England. I came through to South Africa when I was a young teenager, and I've always loved jewelry. I mean, I've always had a thing about it. But when it started to become really real for me was when I spent time with my grandparents in Birmingham. Now, the photographs you can see on the right-hand side were taken in the jewelry quarter of Birmingham. Birmingham is right in the Midlands of England. And my grandfather was a goldsmith. Now, when I say goldsmith, he was a goldsmith and a silversmith, but he wasn't a jeweler. So he did quite a lot of the heavy moving sort of work, shoveling, literally shoveling the molten gold. And then I suppose I must have been about 6 years old when we discovered this photograph you can see on the left-hand side. And I realized from then with the conversation that my great-grandfather used to be a goldsmith as well. And I have a very strong memory because my grandmother used to have all these little bits and pieces of jewelry lying around. And one day she gave me what I now know to be a marquisite sterling silver ring. But it was way too big for my 6-year-old finger. And she sat down. Now, you've got to imagine this. My nan was a bit like Mrs. Brown, the comedic sort of series. And she said to me, "Hey, Bab," she'd called me, "we're going to give you your first piece of real jewelry." But because it was too big, she took a cotton and a needle and she sort of wound it into a bobbin, round and round the shank until eventually it fitted onto my finger. And it was my first piece of real silver. Now, those of you who know marquisite know that it's got like a slight shine on it. And in fact, it's often something that gets muddled up with gold along with pyrite. And I said to my grandmother, "Is this real gold? Is this my first sort of piece of real gold?" And she said, Bab, this is what they call fool's gold. Strictly speaking, it's not. Pyrite is fool's gold. But marquisite is often mistaken. And I tell you what, at the age of 6, the bug bit. Throughout my teens, I kind of collected rough stones because that's my favorite thing. And then over the years, whenever I've traveled, I've always brought bits and pieces back. But when I eventually went into sort of semi-retirement, I suppose, I kind of thought, well, let's fiddle around with jewelry again. And I started bringing in vintage pieces from England, and I went on a gemology course. And all I can tell you is that all these years later, and I've been doing the business side for, must be about 11 years by now, I think it's a subject that will never stop fascinating me. And it's a subject where I never stop learning because you never, ever know everything there is. What I'm going to do today is take you through briefly some of the history, briefly going through the ancient, and then move us forward to some of the stories of intrigue and theft and things where people have fought wars and lost wars and love stories over jewelry. There is something about man and jewelry that makes us do sort of really big stuff. So we'll see if we can share some of those with you. But we've got to begin with the ancients briefly. Back in the day, and I'm going back way back in civilization, jewelry was not something that was for ornamental value. It was purely about rank and role and showing what it is that you meant in society. Look at the photograph on the right-hand side. Now, those were found, we're talking about the Neolithic era, way back then. And women would wear the kind of, you can see the shells on the left-hand side. Those were a specific kind of shell that a woman wore for fertility. By contrast, the men would put together jewelry that had the teeth of whatever animal they'd killed in order to show their prowess and their courage. And it was all about sort of showing off and sort of making a statement to the community. The true story of gold and the things that went on really only began in the Bronze era. If you look at the pictures on the left from the Bronze era, look, and then I've just popped up a couple on the right-hand side from the Egyptian time. And what is for me really interesting is the fact that we haven't changed much in the way we deal with gold. and I'll show you in a minute what it looks like in the workshops, but we've kind of found gold and immediately had a thing for it, and our techniques have not changed too much. I'm going to go technical on you for just a minute. The element for gold is Au, which comes from the Latin word, which is aurum. And if you translate that literally, it means shining dawn, or sometimes called the glow of sunrise, because even back then there was something about the allure of the gold that got people to look. But back in this early era, it was pretty darn useless. Gold is soft. Gold is incredibly soft. So back then they realized we can't use it for tools. We can't use it for survival. And yet there was something about it that still made us go gaga over gold even back then. The archaeological evidence tells us that we started getting a bit smart with gold as far back as 3,000 years BC. And that was when we started using it for all sorts of things. As I said, I say using it, but because it wasn't particularly useful, using it for other means. Gold is an amazing thing. It's very, very malleable. If you take 1 ounce of gold, which is, let's say, roughly 28 grams, and you were to beat the living daylights out of it and spread it, you would be able to get yourself 10 square meters. That's from 1 ounce of gold. Now take that same bit of gold, and you can see, by the way, in the hand on the top right-hand side, it gets very, very thin. It still hangs together. On the top left-hand side is gold that's been, it's ductile, so you can draw it. And if you draw that same 1 ounce of gold and kept on going, you would get an astonishing 80 kilometers of gold wire, which we use in jewelry. The nice thing about gold, it doesn't rust, doesn't corrode, and I mean ever, because as we dig it up out of the tombs and things, you'll see that it's absolutely in pure form. So let me tell you something now. If you've got gold in your jewelry box, which looks like it's corroding, it isn't gold. It's as simple as that. It might be the metals that with the gold, because they can corrode. I promised you the workshops. Now, these workshops I'm showing you, they date back to the 14th, 15th, 16th century. And if you look closely, there's really not much difference between what you're looking at there and what I'm showing you now. Now, this is a photograph taken from the Birmingham, again, the Jewellery Quarter in the Midlands of England. And it was shot sort of more or less after World War I, before World War II. And that was shot in the very place where my grandfather used to work. And that was around about World War II. Not much difference between all the things that I've shown you. We haven't really sort of moved forward. I was lucky enough to be able to go and spend some time in the very area my grandfather worked. And what he used to do is they used to wear these big leather sort of pinnies. And then you can see where I'm seated, they've got like holes in the table. And then what they would do is they would pin the pennies into the table, and then they would work with the gold. And at the end of the day, they'd kind of bring all the bits and pieces into the pennies, leather. And then they would gather them and go off to the guy who was in charge to sort of scoop it all off so that nobody could walk out with even a tiny little bit of gold. It would all be caught in these leather aprons, which you can see I'm sitting with then hooking over there. Is gold pure? No. I've said to you already, there is no such thing as pure gold in jewelry form. Only when you're putting it into the vault and you get the pure form. So I'm not going to dwell on this because I think the stories of and the intrigue of gold are more interesting than the actual breaking down of the elements. But this is something I get asked so often. What then is 9-carat gold? And what do you mean by it's not pure? Now, if you look at the hallmarks on the bottom left-hand side, 375, 925, and the ones above it, 715, 585, those are the most common. If you are getting your jewelry from South Africa, you are most likely have gold, 9-carat gold jewelry, which is 375. And if you're lucky, you'll find a hallmark on the inside of the shank, simply meaning that 37.5% of that metal is pure gold, meaning the other 60-something% is another metal, normally a combination of metals. If you've got a very pure yellowy gold, 18-carat gold, it would be 750. Again, 75% of that is then pure gold, and the other 25% will be something else. Now, I think the purest you'll get in jewelry is 750. I have seen something of 800 and something, but it's very, very rare. And then 14 carat is 585. Again, 58.5%, meaning that it's basically pure gold. So what is the rest made up out of? Well, it's mainly silver, and you get nickel and tin and other alloys. And if you look at the picture on the top left-hand side, you see that very red colored gold. Now that is rose gold, and would mean that out of your gold intake, the other elements would be mainly copper. And when you get a very greenish kind of color, then it would be more silver. And when you get a very white gold, it would most likely be nickel. And platinum is something yet again. So you get all these different sort of mixes that go into your jewelry. But let us begin properly now with the stories that lie behind the stories. And we're going to go back, no surprise, to the tombs. Not going to spend a lot of time here because the funny thing is we associate tombs, particularly Egypt and other areas, with loads and loads of loot, if you like, coming up. But these tombs were robbed over and over and over again. But it's important. It's important to historians because what has come out of those tombs has told us so much about the ancient history. And quite often the jewelry was made for, dare I use the word, the occasion. So if somebody died and gone in, things were being prepared years in advance to send into the tomb with them. People often say, but where does the stone come from? And will say, well, it came from Egypt. It came from the Egyptian tombs. But 9 times out of 10, if you dig around, you'll find that that gemstone or that gold did not come from the area because places like Egypt did not have those kind of jewels. They came from somewhere else. Why that's interesting is because it tells us about the civilizations around the area where the tombs are, and also tells us that people were trading and moving around way before we even realized it. Now, the gent in your picture is Leonard Woolley, and he's one of the very first names to appear in archaeological history, and he dug up the tomb of Ur. Now, we're back in 1922, and we're in Mesopotamia. It's a fascinating tomb that he found. He traveled there, excavated for about 5 years, and he, in fact, went on to do a further 15 tombs. 16 then to his name. But the one that I want to show you belonged to a lady called Queen Puabi, and she dates back to 2600 BC. She was the queen of Ur. In other words, she was a Sumerian royal. And her tomb tells us so much about the era. Can you see the blue and that you're looking at? I'm sure you're guessing what that is. It's lapis lazuli. And the gold is as pure gold as they would have had during that time. Lapis lazuli was an amazingly beautiful stone that was very, very popular during that time. Still is, I must tell you. More about that in a minute. There are the photographs that were taken about the tomb. You can see that it was found on a mound. And when they excavated down, the artist impression below shows you what this place used to look like way back before it was covered up by the sands. And the archaeological team on the right-hand side, top, they were all involved in the digging of this historic kind of place. Photograph here is an artist's impression, but it's a bit grim. But this is an artist's impression of the entourage that was put into this particular tomb with the queen. And when they dug it up, they found all of this and the human beings that you can see inside the tomb. In other words, we know from these impressions that they would have gone in live and they would have been wearing all this jewelry and taken all the things of life after death into the tomb with them. Such was the way in those days. This is the queen herself with some of the jewelry and the headgear that she used to use, all of which came out of that tomb. Loads of lapis lazuli, loads of coral, loads of jet black, and of course the gold. An extraordinary design detail of the crowns are just marvelous. I'd love to have one of those. If you compare that, have a look now, around about the same time, there was a chap digging in Egypt that you will know, and his name is Howard Carter. He was digging up in Egypt at the same time that our first archaeologist was digging. So Woolley was, I think there was about a 5-year difference between them. But Howard Carter we know very well indeed. Why? Because he is the guy who dug up the Tutankhamun tomb. We talk about Tutankhamun as if he sort of produced all sorts of interesting jewelry, but in fact, Tutankhamun's tomb was robbed over and over again. There was very little jewelry except for the masks that we know about. But the tombs that I like, which Howard Carter found, are the tombs of 2 royal members of the family from royal times. And this one is Princess Sit Hathor Unit. She was the daughter of Sesostris II at Laocoon. Date-wise, we're talking about 1897, 1878 BC. Now look at the pieces in her hair. Every single one of those is made out of pure gold. And the amulet in the middle, the scarab beetle, as you may know, was incredibly popular. It was supposed to bring courage and fortitude to those people who wore it. But the way that the amulets came, now obviously the wig is a depiction, but the historians could basically put it all together and work out what the women of the time looked like and how they wore things. Her tomb was rich with jewels, particularly. The other tomb that came up during this time was Merit. Merit, the wife of Ka, and we're talking about 1390 to 1352, as you can see. Now, out of her tomb, we got her masks, and the box that you can see in the middle and on the right-hand side were all bits and pieces of makeup that came up out of that tomb. But the really interesting part about her tomb were the jewels. Now, look at these things. They date all the way back, and yet, if I think about what I've got in my jewelry box, particularly the bottom left-hand side, I've got pieces that look exactly like that. The one in the middle, right on top, that is lapis lazuli with gold. And that great big thing up on top is what they used to force through their ears. So kind of glad I wasn't wearing those ones. Bottom left-hand side, now all of these are earrings, just by the way, but the bottom left-hand side would be worn again through the hole in the earlobe, which came up out of her tomb. And they were made out of like a burnt, like a glass, I suppose, of some forms, which were then mixed up with gold. Beautiful. But really, if you think about it, not too different to sort of the kind of jewelry styles that we have of today. Have a look at this just as a last thought before we leave the tombs behind us. This is lapis lazuli. Top right-hand side is as it occurs naturally. And that gold color that you can see coming through it is pyrite. Lapis lazuli and pyrite. Remembering this stone is millions and millions of years old, but they always grow and occur together. And that is what they call properly fool's gold. But it's so pretty. It's actually one of my prettiest stones of all time. So I'm right there with the Egyptians. Moving forward in history just a little, we're into the Etruscan jewelry time, and we're talking northern Italy, round about the beginning of, let's say, the 7th century BC. At the time, the people around the communities, around the Etruscan communities, used to disregard this lot as being decadent. They were actually often called pirates because they were so over the top with the way they designed their jewelry. But they are a group of people, a community, that single-handedly brought the whole design of jewelry forward. You've got things like filigree and granulation and techniques which we didn't even know existed that was basically used during this time. Grudgingly, even the Romans and the Greeks of that time had to admit that they were the most astonishing craftsmen. We've got things like repoussé, which is the form where you beat with the gold, and the detailing of the filigree. Filigree, by the way, is when you've got them like almost like an open work design between it, which is something which English gold was to pick up on, and still very, very popular. You've got the boule. Those things, they don't look like it, they look like little bags, but those are earrings that used to be put into the earlobes, and they're the ones that came up with this design, which the French then kind of adopted in many years later. Here's some more of the filigree. See what I mean about the open work detail? And they would take the gold, the way I told you about earlier, where they would beat it and then sort of hand work it into these extraordinary crowns of the time. It really was a huge step forward in terms of how we work with jewelry, and the craftsmanship remains to this day amongst the best. Alexander the Great, we've got to send a nod into his direction, because this was the Hellenistic period. And we owe Alexander the Great a nod of thanks for the gold. No, he didn't have it where he was, but wherever he went on his war, his rampages, he would make sure that his soldiers brought back gold. And as a result, Alexander the Great amassed an enormous amount of gold. And he, rather generously married 3 Persian wives along the way, which made sure he had lots of gold coming his direction. But the thing that we thank the most in the Hellenistic period of time was color. They were the people that first fell in love with the idea of putting colored gemstones into gold in this way. Those are garnets. And garnets are a wonderful stone. You get many, many different types of garnets, but they were particularly into the reds and things like that. So when we look back on that period of time, we go, okay, we have now entered a new period where jewelry and gold mixed with gemstones is what's going to be the future. I'm jumping forward just a little to now some of the interesting stories, and this is one of my favorites. We're into the era of Charlemagne. Charlemagne, we're talking the Carolingian age, 9th and 10th century, obviously now into the modern time. He was the emperor of Europe, and round about the year 800, properly, founder of the Holy Roman Empire. There were lots of traditions, as you gathered, about burying gold with the dead. And here we are in the modern era, if you like, but people were still going with the idea that when you died, you got buried with all your jewelry. And Charlemagne stopped this. He thought this was the improper thing to do. So he actually made a law saying, if you die, on you go, but you leave your jewelry behind. And secondly, he decided that jewelry was only fitting for royalty and for people like himself and the church and nobility. For me, it's quite interesting is that we think that jewelry is entirely about adornment, but if you can hear from what I've been telling you so far, there's been nothing frivolous. It's all been about who you are and depicting your rank in life. We still haven't got to the era when jewelry was about, what shall I wear every morning? That comes much later. The lightning flash question mark, well, it's a question mark as we call it, just as a by the way, he was the man that actually kind of invented it and decided that when your voice goes up at the end in a question, then you need to have this mark. So Charlemagne, we go thank you, because he's the one who gave us the question mark, or as I said, the lightning flash. So to the story of the talisman. Charlemagne had the most extraordinary piece of jewelry. That's it on the left-hand side. It was a very large, well, it was about 190 carats of sapphire, a very grey blue sapphires, you can even see. 2 sapphires set into gold, back to back. On one side, it was oval, and the other side was sort of more square. Now, right in the middle of this piece of jewelry, Charlemagne had, and it's never told us how he got hold of these, but he had 2 relics. One was a piece of the true cross, allegedly, and one was a tiny clip of Mary's hair, allegedly, both of which were put and trapped into this relic, and he then wore it every day of his life. It was his most important treasure. He felt that it gave him the holy power of leading his people forward. It weighed 163 grams, never took it off. Then he died. He died in 814, and he was entombed and he was buried. And there ends the story of the talisman. But no, it doesn't. There begins the story of the talisman, because years later, Otto the Third, and we're into now about the year 1000, opened the tomb. Now, it sounds like he is trying to have a dig around the tombs like the tomb diggers. But the truth is that Otto III really respected Charlemagne and thought he was the most extraordinary leader. So he felt if he could go and embrace what was Charlemagne, what was left of him, it would bequeath upon him some of that extraordinary power. And of course, once they opened the tomb, they found the talisman. So Otto thought, right, while we're at it, we'll have the talisman too. So he took it back, and it remained and was carried on from monarch to monarch for years and years. Then it reappeared all these years later, that exact talisman. And again, history doesn't tell us how it moved across the continents, but it landed up in the hands of Napoleon. And Napoleon, of course, gave it to his Josephine. And the event for which he gave this extraordinary gift was their coronation. So she wore it, and she used to wear it quite a lot. Now, if you know your history, you know that eventually the two of them parted company, they divorced. Clever girl, she kept the jewelry. So the talisman stayed with Josephine, and this amuletic was then sort of passed on. Josephine died in 1814, and she left it on to her daughter, Hortense. In this image, you can actually see Hortense wearing the talisman. She loved to wear it with her cloaks, and she had her people rearrange it so it kind of got attached, almost like a clasp, which went onto the cloak. Time goes forward. She passed it on to her son, the future Napoleon III. Went through Hortense to Eugenie. And we're coming into sort of more modern history with the fall of the Second French Empire, if you like. And Empress Eugenie absolutely loved this piece of gold and wasn't going to let go of it. So did her husband. This is an image of Napoleon III's bedroom. You can't see it very clearly, but next to his bed, there's in the artwork, there is a tiny little bit of a table with something on it. That is the talisman. And he apparently used to pop it next to his bedside table whenever he went to sleep at night. So he had a love affair with this talisman. And there are the two of them in those later life before sort of he moved on and died. Now he did. Eugenie kept the piece of gold and it was taken across to England. What happened after that is that she bequeathed it. It was her last wish that it be handed over to Notre Dame. And in Notre Dame, of course, you have the Cathedral of Reims. And the reason she even had it written up in her will was that she felt, and I'll quote you, "It is the formal wish of the Empress that it be given to the Cathedral of Reims in reparation for the outrages that it suffered during the war of 1914 to 1918. And with this relic, I give the remaining to the property and give the job of and the duty for the Archbishop of Reims to take whatever measures he deems necessary to achieve this end." And there it is. It sits now in Notre Dame, safely locked up, and hopefully nobody's dug it up and is going to dig it up anymore, but it's come to the end of a very, very long history. It's a beautiful, beautiful, unusual piece. The Renaissance got to be one of the most glamorous and interesting parts of history, but it lasted a long time, remember. It went over 14th, 15th, 16th, 17th century. So we have a lot of things going on over like a lot of period of history. But here, for the first time, we hear the word jewel. It got picked up by the French, and it's the very first time in our history when we've learned how to cut through a stone. Very primitive cutting. You can see these are actual examples from that time. And we have something come into being called the lapidarists, as opposed to the goldsmiths, which simply means these are the people who gem cut. And we have our very first tabletop. If you look at the pictures on the second and in the middle and on the right-hand side, you can see the facets of this of the stone now coming down, and you've got yourself a tabletop. Didn't go beyond there. There's nothing complicated about this faceting, but at least it was the start of an era when jewels could be cut. This going forward, we're in the early Renaissance at this time. Now, fashion and jewelry completely matched. 15th century, we started to hint at the fashions that weren't just symbolic of rank, just hinting. And you can see for yourself that because the style of that era was to sort of have the neck exposed, all of a sudden, then the ladies of the time, royalty in particular, would be able to wear these very kind of over-the-top pieces to kind of match and counter off their pieces of clothing. Then you get the clipped-in of the cuffs, if you look on the right-hand side, because you had those puffy sleeves and the clipped-in cuffs, then the ladies at the time would then move on and wear interesting pieces of bracelet. And if you look at all the pictures, everything about their clothing and the jewelry sort of matches. It had to sort of interweave. Interesting, did you know, it was during this same time, again, reminding you that we're talking about this sort of early Renaissance moving into the middle, for the first time you had wholesale jewelry, which means that we're starting to be able to turn it over into what were the early shops and make it more available. There was an ongoing battle between the lapidarists and the goldsmiths because the one thought they were more superior in their skill set than the other. And importantly, I think from what Sue's told me, some of you might be involved or used to be involved in design work. And it might interest you to know that it was during this period of time that for the very first time, we see patterns that would be recorded and printed. In other words, you could get people copying it. And up until then, hadn't happened. What you're looking at are designs by Virgil Solus from Nuremberg, and also the Frenchman, Etienne Dalun. And they actually printed pattern books to sort of pass on. Moving forward in the Renaissance, of course, it gets more and more extravagant. The clothing, the way of life, the jewelry. And we couldn't go much further forward without mentioning this gentleman, Henry Henry VIII. Interesting part of Henry VIII is that his love of jewelry was excessive, and more so than even his wives. During this period of time, the artist was supposed to be the hallowed member of court, capturing images such as the one you see before you. What you perhaps don't know is that the artist, I'm talking paint, would then often become the jewelers. Why? Because they felt that the fine handwork that was required on an artist would translate well into jewelry. So your designers, your top designers in jewelry of this era were all of them artists who would then be deployed as jewelers. It was not two different careers. The most famous one of them all was the German. His name's Hans Holbein. And in this piece I'm showing you there, he designed that for Henry, and it was called the Balas rubies. Small detail, the Balas rubies, that piece of jewelry is not a ruby. It's actually a spinel. Spinel is real. It's a natural gemstone. And the red ones are often mistaken for rubies or deliberately used instead of rubies. And the blue ones look a lot like sapphire. And still are. I get spinel gemstones quite often in my jewelry, and it's quite a thing. You've got to put it under the eyeglass because it definitely doesn't have the same chemical inclusions. But with the naked eye, it's exactly what it looks like. Those are spinel. This one was around about 1536, and Henry loved that particular piece of jewelry so much that he ordered one in every single color, as only Henry VIII could do. But the one that remained his number one was the ruby. The other thing Henry had a penchant for was gold chains. And the more and the heavier, the better. It was a crazy time of excess in terms of jewelry. During the history book time of study, they found an invoice that was for Henry for £190 sterling item of just a chain, and it weighed the same as 500 wedding bands. Now, during this period of time, gold, of course, then as it now, can double up as currency. And you'll find that a lot of these kind of pieces, we've lost most of them because they would have been melted down, they would have been used as currency. So sadly, we don't have much to show us the actual workmanship, but we do have some, plenty enough to sort of talk us through. This is a very Henry VIII thing. He decided, in fact, they say he's kind of the inventor of the idea of having your initials on jewelry. There's the poor Anne Boleyn of the history books. And you can see on the right-hand side, that was one of her pieces of jewelry with an A in the middle for Anne, and it's set into an H for Henry. And Henry loved the idea of initials so much that he made sure that every single one of his wives had their own initials. And the person who had to make them, by the way, each time was Holbein. And lucky for Holbein, clever Henry, he had 3 Catherines and 2 Annes. So I guess there was a fairly good chance there was some stock in the cupboard with C's and A's on it. The trend continues. Youngsters today love having their sort of initials and names. So amongst royalty, this has continued with the British family. Meghan has got, they've recorded about 8 or 9 different varieties of these initial tags. She's got one there for Harry and Meghan. She's got a little gold thing here with a diamond in, which is with a big H on it. And Kate has had one made for each one of her 3 children, which now hangs on this necklace. So the youngsters have actually continued this tradition, started by Henry VIII. Another part of the late Renaissance which remains with us is the Tudor rose. The Tudor rose is a beautiful thing, which basically was about bringing the 2 houses together, York and Lancashire. It was the end of the War of the Roses. And you've got the Royal House of Lancashire, who always wore red, and they had the red rose. And then you had the Royal House of York, who were white. And then by combining the two, it became a very important symbol of peace. And the Tudor rose today continues. I'm not going to dive down the technology of assays, but when you have British gold, you'll have one of 4 assays. And the Shield of Sheffield, one of the 4, is designed based on this same Tudor rose to honor it from the history. The Queen herself has got a brooch, and this one is what they call the Tech Crescent tiara. If you look a little bit very closely at it, it was passed down from Teck, by the way, was Queen Mary's mother. She was the Duchess of Teck. So the crown featuring the Tudor rose went through the family from the Duchess of Teck, the Queen Mother, through to Queen Elizabeth herself. That's the Queen Mom on the bottom right-hand side. And if you look closely, you'll see that on the extreme left, the Duchess of Teck, there was like a double row of diamonds, which they've then modernized and taken off to make it like a single crown. And here is the Queen wearing her Tudor rose. She's very, very partial to that diamond brooch, which she wears a lot of the time. At about that same time, there wasn't just diamonds and stones that was attracting all the attention. This was the big era of pearls. Now, pearls have been around forever, I know that. But it was during this period of time that pearls started taking center stage. Again, we're still in the late Renaissance. As designers, have a look at what they did with it. You know, these are all extraordinary examples of taking what is a really organic, knobbly, but natural Baroque pearl, and then creating things around it. It became like a form of art of the day. It was the very first time in history we hear the word Baroque. 1694 was the first time it was recorded. A Baroque pearl is, in fact, I think there I've even got one around my neck. This is a Baroque pearl. If you want to put it in layman's terms, it's just a knobbly but organic, in other words, natural pearl. But from that, way back in history, the word Baroque actually comes from Barroco itself, which is Portuguese, and it simply means directly oddly shaped pearl. But because they're natural, they were sought after, so people would sort of work really hard at trying to do things with them. It became a really big thing. Remember, just to say this to you, that a pearl is not a stone, even though in jewelry we speak about pearls in the same vocabulary. It's not, it's organic. It's organic like coral, like jet. Jet is a form of black jewelry that is also natural, and it's sort of encouraged, and yet it is regarded in the jewelry world as being stones. It tends to get lumped into the same category. Got to put this one up to share with you. Cleopatra. On your left, close up of her pearl. On the right, Antony and Cleopatra, amongst the most decadent of all characters in history. One of my favorites is that they started a club called the Inimitable Livers. It was a drinking society, and the two of them together used to go and cause havoc because they would dress up in fun clothing, disguise themselves, go into the streets with way too much wine in their hand and go and jostle with the crowds. And they used to try and outdo each other with dinner parties. And one day, and this is where this story comes from, Cleopatra said, I'm the one that's going to claim the most expensive dinner party of all time for the society. And they looked at the bill and they said, nah, it's not as good as the one we had last week. And she said, it is now. And she took off her pearl, she dropped it into wine, threw it back, voila, one pearl down the hatch. And she has the claim of having the most expensive bill for any dinner party ever hosted, thanks to her pearl. Just for one moment, I want to show you this because those are not real. Organic pearls are put into an oyster. You don't often get wild pearls these days. They're quite rare, actually. They're cultured on farms. Yeah, they're real. They're real, but they're not wild. And you have something introduced into the mollusk, and then tissue grows up around it, and then the pearl grows. But back in the day, there used to be a drive to actually outdo the pearl with imitation. And you had a thing called Paragine. A French rosary maker would be hollow glass, which would then be coated in a sort of a paint. It was a pearly paste, which they called the essence of the Orient. It sounded much better than pearly paint. And they'd often use fish scales, and they would fill this with wax. And the combination would look like basically the real thing. And in this image here, which is an advertisement from back then, the Roman pearl made out of alabaster beads, which were dipped into fish sauce and then lacquered. But the pearl queen of them all has got to be this lady, Queen Elizabeth I. She called it her signature. She went to bed in pearls. She went everywhere with pearls. She bathed in pearls. She literally had so many months of necklaces of pearls and necklaces, it was ridiculous. But she was the one who put pearls on the map in terms of her high fashion. But there was one delicious pearl story, which I'm going to share with you, which comes not from England and Elizabeth I, but France. The Mancini pearl story. The Mancini pearls, we're talking about Louis XIV, and there he is. It's a very young version of Louis XIV because he kind of got a bit more bloated and more later gallery pictures. But he had a girlfriend, and the girlfriend's name was Marie Mancini. Louis was besotted with Marie. She was around the court. She was one of the people who was always there whenever he looked up. And he found for her some pearl earrings that he gave. He wanted to marry her. And these pearls, there they are. Those are the real things. Came, they believe, from the Medici family. And he gave them to her as a sort of an offer of promise to say, I will be marrying you. However, they didn't get married because the Cardinal Mazarin of the court had other ideas and wanted to have something a little bit more politically filled with clout. So in fact, Louis was married off with the Infant Maria Teresa of Spain. But this lady here in front of you, Marie, she actually kind of bid farewell, took the pearls with her, I might tell you, and is known in history today for having written her memoirs. And I do quite a bit of writing. It's one of my hobbies. And what I love about this lady is she was officially the first woman of the elite in France to publish her memoirs. So she went on to do all sorts of interesting things in her life with her pearls kind of intact and on her ears. Diamonds. The more we dig into the stories of diamonds, the more you hear about the myths and the stories behind it. But we've got to just mention first the cutting. Rose cut versus brilliant cut. We're talking 16th century tools that came forward. A lot of people say to me, how does this all come about? In the early days, they would cut to about 24 facets. And then as time went forward, it became more facets. And you've got the modern day thing, the brilliant cut, which you most frequently get, which has got round about 58 facets. Having told you this, in the early days of the diamonds in France were always very, very popular. And one of the greatest stories at the time was the 18th century diamond necklace affair. The characters are Louis XV, and again, not with his wife, but with his mistress, Comte de Barry. And he had the court jewelers make for her the most incredible, extraordinary necklace. It had 647 flawless diamonds. And there it is on the left-hand side. How you wear that, I don't know. But anyway, he had this made for his mistress. And then things went a little bit wrong because he died before paying the bill. Now, the jewelers were Boumin and Bossange, and there were so many diamonds in this that they basically just about went bankrupt before they could actually hand over the goodies. More detail, their patron had died. Now what? What on earth were they going to do about it? Now, by this stage, we had Louis XVI around. So, no surprise, they offered it to Louis XVI. And legend would have it, well, history tells us, but he said, no, they're too expensive. Did Louis XVI say, no, they're too expensive to anything? But he did. And again, the stories tell us that apparently he showed it to Marie Antoinette and she tried it on and went, no, too much, as if Marie Antoinette ever said too much. But it never went through to royalty. So now what? The jewelers are stuck with this. And then begins the story of intrigue, because the lady on your right-hand side is an ordinary lass of the French time who saw the opportunity of a con. Her name is Jeanne, or Jean, if you like, de Saint-Remy, and her husband was a con man, and the two of them decided we can do something about this. So they started to masquerade, or she did anyway, as somebody close to Marie Antoinette. Now, at the time, Cardinal Louis de Rohan was out of favor. So she went, hung out with the cardinal, persuaded him that she was in the court of Marie Antoinette. He bought into it, gave her money to go and live the high life. And the day came when eventually the jeweler heard about it and said, please help us get this diamond necklace to Marie Antoinette. And she was going, I think we can do something about it, but we're going to do it all through the cardinal. And the cardinal, because he so badly wanted to be back in favor with the court, said, fine. He put up the money, got the jewels, got the diamonds, handed it over to our con lady. Guess what? She disappeared. And in fact, the diamonds have gone forever and a day. But they caught her. A year later, they caught up with her, arrested her. It was one of the biggest trials in the history of mankind. The cardinal on your right-hand side was also arrested, but in fact, he got away with it. They decided there wasn't enough evidence that he was the bad guy behind it. But she, well, she was sent off into jail. She was flogged. She was branded. And that was the end of that story. Not quite, because Hilary Swank popped up again and relived the story in a brilliant movie about it. But never will we forget this sensation. Why this is so important? This happened, it reached its conclusion in more or less 1784. Who knew about this? The people. The people of France knew about this money being bandied around. So when her court case took place, there wasn't a seat to be had. And I'm not saying it started the French Revolution, but if you look at the history books, they'll say that this anger against royalty for the excess, and yet they would have us believe that Marie Antoinette herself had nothing to do with it. She didn't know about it. She didn't want anything to do with the diamond necklace, but that's not how the people saw it. 1789, of course, the French Revolution. So maybe it did play a role. During that time, jewelry shops, just showing you that one shop, became a thing, and people started buying the jewelry. So I'm going to share with you just a couple now of very specific diamond stories, one of which is a story of tragedy. The first one is this diamond. It is the Koh-i-Noor, which translates into mountain of light. Goes back to the 1500s. Sultan Babur was the one who first had it, the Mughal Empire days. And it landed up in the hands of Nader Shah when he led the Persians through India, and he came away with this glorious diamond. He pillaged it, basically, stole it, along with something called the Peacock Throne, which is another story for another day. And the bad news hit him straight away. On the way back, Nader, there he is, was assassinated on his return journey. Passed into the hands of another great Punjab leader, the Lion of the Punjab Singh, landed eventually in a company name that we know quite well, the East India Company. And it was used in partial payment after the Punjab Wars. And then it moved across to England. Queen Victoria acquired it. Doesn't tell us how, but it was no doubt in part of these payments for the wars. And the funny part about this glorious, enormous diamond, it was put on show here. That is Crystal Palace. I used to visit Crystal Palace quite frequently when I was a child. It didn't look like that. But she put it in and on display as the key exhibit of the opening of the Crystal Palace exhibition. We're talking 1850. And what did the onlookers say? Oh dear, said the press, so dull. True story. All of the presses said it was incredibly dull. Queen Victoria was mortified, and she took this great thing away, and she had it recut and chopped down to a sort of 108 carats, a mere 108 carats. And this is where it is today. And it's popped up in Queen Elizabeth's crown. There it is. You can see it in the Tower of London. And it's very much part of the royal collection. Not the biggest stone, though. That honor is with us, with the Cullinan diamond. You can see on the picture there that the Cullinan diamond is absolutely beautiful, but by far the biggest diamond. Just briefly, the South African story actually started with a smaller thing called the Dudley diamond. And I tell you that story because it always amuses me that some chappie, a Griquas chappie, dug this thing up, and it turned out to be eventually the Dudley diamond. But he sold it over to the government of what was then Transvaal. And his price for this diamond, 500 sheep, 10 oxen, and 1 horse. And so began trading of diamonds in South Africa. But it wasn't the biggest one. The biggest one was the Cullinan 1, which was originally 3,000 something carats. It came to be cut. It was brought down to about 9 big diamonds and 100 very, very small ones, and sort of landed up all over the place. Granny's chips. Chips is a word that some people use to describe smaller diamonds, and apparently the royal family laughingly called this one Granny's chips. But that is a piece of the Cullinan diamond that she likes to wear on her brooch over there. So it's worth mentioning to you, by the way, that the diamond was sort of sent across to be cut. South Africa gave it to England. I don't know what they were thinking. And this is how it landed up with England. But the way it was posted eventually around South Africa, the Cullinan diamond was actually dispatched in a normal little packet because they were terrified it would be stolen. And this was a story that was to be repeated with another diamond later. But the guy who actually cut it was a bloke from Amsterdam. And the king at the time, which was would have been Edward the Seventh, sent it over. He was a master kind of cutter. And the stress of this thing, his name was Asher. And apparently when he put his steel blade onto this enormous diamond the first time, the blade broke. And he had a hissy fit and nearly didn't go back again, and eventually did. And allegedly, according to the articles, fainted from exhaustion after cutting this famous diamond. Right, the Hope diamond, the cursed blue Hope diamond. You can't honestly make this stuff up, but here it is in its facts. Originally, it was a blue diamond, 112 carats, and triangular cut. And Jean-Baptiste Tavernier brought it back, that's him on the right-hand side, brought it back from India. And it was called originally the Tavernier Blue. It was actually a sort of almost like a tanzanite color, violet, if you like. The story begins with him. He lost his fortune. He died. It was sold to Louis XIV. There he is in the middle, 1668. It was cut to 69 carats. Louis XIV died. He had gangrene, which is eventually what took him out. The diamond passed into the hands of somebody who'd been in his court. The name of this chap is Nicholas Fouquet. And Nicholas was simply in the court, but he used to pilfer around in Louis's jewelry box, and he wore it. This poor chap fell out of favor in court and became the famous or infamous Man in the Iron Mask. I don't think it was just because he used to wear King Louis's jewelry, but he fell to sort of an end of it. Then it fell into new hands. It came forward to Louis's infamous mistress, the Marquise de Montespan. Now, that image on your left-hand side, this lady was involved with a group of very dodgy magicians, as you can see, but she used to wear this thing when she used to go off with these things. And the community, if I can loosely call it a community, was led by a man of the church, the Abbé Etienne Goldberg. Well, she fell into trouble, and the diamond eventually was sent through to Marie. We've got Marie Antoinette, and of course we know what happened to her. And then somebody in her court started messing around in the jewelry box, Princess de Lamballe. And she eventually, she got butchered by the revolutionary mob. So that didn't last long in her hands. Then, after her, there's the lady, by the way, who got butchered in the story. Then it was stolen during the French Revolution, and it disappeared for years and years and years. And then it eventually came through into the hands. It popped up inexplicably. And this chap, it was a cutter, a diamond cutter. His name is Wilhelm False, and he actually landed up cutting it down to 45 carats. I have to ask the question why, but never mind. It was cut down again in carats. And the story and the tragedy begins. His son stole the diamonds. He was killed by his father and then committed the son and then committed suicide. So not much happy news in terms of that one. And it disappeared again, but still not the end of this extraordinary and tragic tale. It landed up in England, in London, and a London banking family bought this diamond. And maybe you can guess what the name of the family is. Hope. This is how it acquired the name the Hope. And there was a Greek merchant who acquired it, 1910. He sold it on to Cartier. And this gentleman, Simon, he landed up driving over the cliff. Told you couldn't make this stuff up. It was then sold to this lady on the left-hand side, Evelyn Walsh McLean. a rich heiress, and she rather liked attaching it to her doggy's collar. There's the doggy on the right-hand side. And all was well, right up until the following happened. Evelyn's mother-in-law died. Her son died. He was only 9 years old. Her husband left her for another woman. And he later died in a psychiatric hospital. The daughter then died of a drug overdose. And Evelyn eventually had to sell her newspaper. She owned the Washington Post. That's where her money came from. Yep, she died in debt. And the surviving children then sold the diamond on to a famous jewelry. So I don't think anybody wanted this jewelry. There it is, being sold. 1958, the very same thing was donated by the jeweler. Maybe they decided that buying and selling wasn't the best way of handling this particular piece of diamond, but it went to the Smithsonian Institute. And here's the second story of it being posted. They were so terrified of it being stolen and falling into the wrong hand that they sent it through the US mail for $2.44 in postage, and then they paid the grand sum total of $155 per insurance, just in case it got stolen. I mean, it's priceless. The tragedy continues. The mailman who delivered the diamond to the Smithsonian suffered a truck accident and a head injury, and on the same day his house burnt down. True, all of this is in the history books. Anyway, the Hope Diamond, it's now housed on the right-hand side in the Cape Town Diamond Museum. No, it's not. That's a replica. And there is the real diamond on the left-hand side, and it remains in the National Museum of Natural History in Washington. And there endeth the story is one of the saddest of diamonds in all of history. And as I draw towards the end of my diamond stories, I have to share this story of jewelry with you about. It's one of my favorite. A Man and His Jewels, Napoleon I. It's just such a brilliant look into a man's heart. Napoleon, kind of a man of excess, I suppose. When it came to Josephine, nothing too much. 1804, he was emperor. And during his days of military warfare, he would encourage his soldiers to bring every scrap of jewelry they could. He was basically bringing, so he said, the French jewelry back home to where it rightfully belonged. So he gathered them together, and then he would rather creatively cobble them together. And this lass, Josephine, well, she wasn't into doing things on a simple basis. She basically, there was an inventory that was taken during this time, and they recorded 673 dresses of velvet, 33 dresses of cashmere, 202 dresses for the summertime, 520 pairs of shoes, and those were the current ones. 265 shoes carried over from the year before. And that's only the wardrobe. When it came to the jewelry, she couldn't have enough of it. And one of the things that Napoleon loved, not Josephine, but Napoleon, were the cameos. He had a thing about cameos. And they got this lady on the right is Napoleon's sister, Pauline. And in fact, if you look over here, I'm going to show you where some of this actually landed up in modern day. This was Josephine's crown that Napoleon had made for her. Every single one of those cameos is different because it had to be authenticized, and each one is like a bit of a different story. And it passed from France to Sweden, because the rather gorgeous looking girl in the middle is the Princess Victoria on her wedding day, and her mum, Queen Sylvia, also wore the same crown on the wedding day. So this crown from Napoleon now sits in the royal house of royalty. But to my man of the moment, Napoleon I. I don't know whether you know this, but he was a bumblebee man. And there's a reason. 1653. There was a stonemason who was digging around doing a church construction. And what happened was his spade, his shovel, I suppose, hit something which turned out to be an archaeological dig. And it turned out to be the city of Tournai. And up came out of this dig from this poor, surprised, blind, I might mention, and mute, I might mention, mason, jewelry and 300 stylized gold bees, all of them with garnets put into the wings. It turned out to be the tomb of Childeric, which was the founder king or the Merovingian dynasty. In other words, this is the man that the French call the father of France. And Napoleon was so taken with this story of the fact that we had come across this ancient piece of royalty. They thought, well, if he wore what came out of that digging, then this would basically cover him with the same dignity and sense of importance, because remember, he wasn't actually royal, and the people would then follow him. So Napoleon went bumblebee bonkers. Everything about Napoleon is bumblebees. His advisors were saying, sir, perhaps you prefer to have the fleur-de-lis as your brand. And he was going, bumblebees, this is what I want to be. These shoes on the top right-hand side were the shoes that Josephine wore when they got married. They had bumblebees all over their regalia. The cameos had the bumblebees. Every single part of whatever he did, bumblebees. He declared bumblebees and jewelry to only be worn by the people he decided during his reign. And then this is called the Légion d'honneur. And you can see that he had a bee put into that emblem. It's the highest honor you can get outside France as well. So he allowed that into that particular emblem, but it was bumblebees, bumblebees. Now, there's a piece of history that his followers criticized him because he would hand over some of these pieces of jewel as a way of recognizing them, with favor. And they said, sir, these are but baubles. How can you use baubles, a man of your position? And his answer was, it is with baubles that men are led. So said Napoleon I. Napoleon I, as we know, it was a bit downhill all the way, but this is the part I love. He was, as you may or may not know, exiled to Elba. And he had nothing but an island and a sort of rundown house. But he said, Elba is going to have a flag. And on this flag, we are going to have the bumblebees. And that is the original flag of Elba, with its 3 bumblebees going down. And he eventually was moved on from there, and he died at St. Helene, didn't he, in the end? But he will be remembered in my heart anyway as the man with the bumblebees. And as I wind down, a little bit of showing you where crowns have been and where crowns have gone. And this is a crown that went through from the head of Josephine through to the head of Grace of Monaco. Exactly the same crown that she then loved to, it was her favorite, that she loved to wear. Just worth mentioning, because I know that so many of you, fond of your design and where the story goes, just a moment to show you, a bit morbid, but jewelry reflecting culture. This was the jewelry of the French Revolution. The women would often cut their hairs off, not their heads, definitely not their heads, their hair in sympathy with what was going on, and then demonstrate almost like a sort of religious crosses. And then you had this, which they called, proper word, jewelry morbid jewelry, which fascinates me, that the society felt so inclined that they wanted to reflect what was going on around. Grisly stuff, grisly indeed. And these images are Queen Victoria did exactly the same thing. She put England into mourning for tens and tens of years. Originally, it was William V, which was her uncle. And she declared a period of mourning. And then in 1861, Albert then died, so the mourning continued. And all the jewelry, these are all showing hair of beloved people who've passed on. Ugh. It's something which I can never get my head around, but it was a thing of the Victorian era. And eventually, only in 1885 did people complain. In 1887, she allowed them to wear something else besides this. See, all of this is made out of hair. Your last wrap-up is a couple of your crowns, just to show you. The Delhi Durbar tiara came from Delhi, went through the generations of the queen of the family, and that, out of interest, was the very first crown that Camilla wore for a proper occasion. And that's where it popped up on her head. Choker to wrist, Queen Mary through to Kate, but she had it converted from the choker into the more modern version of a bracelet. She wears that bracelet actually quite a lot. And you probably know that the ring she's wearing was the enormous sapphire that she got from her, what would have been anyway, her mother-in-law, from Diana. The Strathmore Rose tiara, it was the favorite of Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon when she was Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, which of course we know as being the Queen Mother. And on her wedding day, her father had that made for her because she wasn't wearing royal crowns until after she married. So this is what she wore on her wedding day. And if you look at the pictures, you'll see that she wore it on her wedding day low, which was the style. And then later in life, she wore it high. She had it made differently. And then Kate popped up recently wearing it for the first time in ages. The lotus flower tiara, again from Queen Mum. Can you see how she's wearing it very, very low on this is how it's designed on the eyebrow, passed on to her daughter, Margaret, passed on to Kate over there. And this is Serena Stanhope, which is the daughter-in-law of Princess Margaret. And she wore it on her wedding day. I'm quite sure it goes back into the vaults. Oh, and an interesting trivia is that royal people are not allowed to wear crowns before 5 p.m. It is very, very non-new. So the rule is after 5 p.m. and a young lady coming to society may only wear a crown for the first time when she gets married. So you'll see that things like Fergie's daughters, they don't wear crowns. They recently got married and now they're allowed to wear crowns from their wedding day. This one, just going back there, was the mega of upskilling. This was a bracelet, sorry, not a bracelet, a necklace that was given to the Queen Mum as a gift, and it got refashioned into a crown. See, let me show you again. There it is as it was given to her by her doting husband as a wedding gift. And you can sort of see closely the Greek motif, you know, to do with the heritage of the family. And bing bang wallop, it lands up on her head. Then the Dagmar necklace is the last one I'll show you. It's got to be the most extraordinary piece of royal jewelry. Look on the right-hand side. That is a relic that dates back to the year 1000. And it's a look at the Queen Elizabeth wearing it on the left-hand side. She takes it off. They kind of very splendidly made it so she can clip it on and clip it off. But it's said to be one of the most priceless pieces of jewelry, and she hardly ever wears it. My guess is it weighs about 300 tons. And there's the end of my royal stories. Why am I so fascinated with it? Well, read that for yourself. Every atom in your body came from a star that exploded. And the atoms in your left hand probably came from a different star than your right hand. It really is the most poetic thing I know about physics. You are all stardust. Maybe that's the attraction of jewelry. I don't know, but I certainly have it within me. And there you go. It's just a little hint of some of the stories behind the history of jewelry.